So you don't expect a disorderly collapse for Evergrande. How much of a relief is this for Evergrande bondholders as well as a broader property sector?
Well, Sherry, this was never going to be China's Lehman moment, despite that being the initial reaction. And I think it's become very clear over the last several weeks that Chinese state authorities are pretty deeply involved in managing this crisis, all the way from offloading Evergrande's projects to other developers to working with the company to come up with a debt restructuring plan. Now, there is going to be pain for some parties involved. Foreign investors obviously are the most nervous of the entire group, whereas Chinese households are on the top of the list of people or entities that need to be taken care of. Nevertheless, again, there is no Lehman-like panic or crisis that is happening. That said, there is a broader property market distress story that investors need to keep an eye on because the Chinese property market is going to be under pressure for the foreseeable future, regardless of what happens with Evergrande.
Did the Politburo meeting recently signaling potential more easing in the property sector change the narrative at all?
So, we got back some data in November and looked at it. And yes, there has been some amounts of easing as far as the property sector is concerned. Property firms were able to get more bank loans, which was a big change from the previous quarter. They were able to sell more bonds. So yes, you are seeing some amounts of loosening of that of credit policy there. But it may not be enough. You could see this sector do a little bit better. Its pain ease compared to where it was in the third quarter, where it was just downright horrible. But the long-term picture, if the economy is transitioning away from this high debt, high investment, high growth model, then that by definition would mean that the property sector is going to have a pretty bumpy road ahead.
But that high debt, high growth investment model has also benefited just regular wealth holders, right? What happens to consumer sentiment, not to mention the knock-on effect to the dozens of industries that rely on the property sector, but when it comes to the average Chinese consumer whose wealth is tied up in property, what does that mean for the Chinese consumer and consumption going forward?
Yeah, that's why I think protecting households has become such a key priority for policymakers in Beijing, because you have so many Chinese households who are not only waiting on being made whole by getting their apartments that they paid for years ago, but have also bought wealth management products and are tied in to Evergrande's debt, and they can't be made to bear the losses here. The reality is that whatever's happening in the property sector right now is most likely going to have some impact on consumption down the road as well, dampening of consumer sentiment, consumer confidence. But that's exactly the sort of thing I think right now that Beijing is sort of trying to stave off as it tries to ring fence, the crisis happening with Evergrande.
Was the RRR cut this week any kind of inflection point, or does the prudent monetary policy continue? Do you see kind of more of a lean towards easing given how politically sensitive this next year is?
Well, look, there is going to be easing in 2022 because of what you just said, because it's a politically sensitive year. But I think this week's RRR cut, a lot of market commentators have gotten too giddy at trying to claim that this is the inflection point. I think it's too early to call that. The RRR cut was rather small, and we also don't know if it's actually reaching the real economy. The question that we need to really be tracking is credit making its way to the real economy? And then number two, within that, which types of firms are actually getting access to loans? Is it just going to be large firms again, or is it going to be directed towards SMEs? Our latest data suggests that SMEs are actually still having a pretty hard time getting credit, and large firms are not. So those are the sorts of things, access by companies, that we need to be more concerned with, rather than just what's coming down the pipeline from the supply side.
Is the deleveraging drive serious this time? Because particularly as you mentioned, these political sensitivities are going into next year, is there going to be more of, or I should say less of a willingness to be able to go hard on these companies?
So 2022 is naturally going to be the exception year because of the Party Congress and President Xi's third term and all of that. But I think there has been a paradigm shift inside of China. That old playbook that we just referenced has certainly gone out the window. And the new playbook, if there's a transition away from this, cutting back on debt and so forth, and that means there is seriousness in terms of deleveraging. This year, most certainly, we've seen corporate borrowing fall quarter after quarter. Even official data has shown a slowdown in credit growth all throughout this year, counter to what markets were expecting at the beginning. So deleveraging and being serious about that is going to have to be part of the package if the Chinese economy is to transition to a more sustainable growth pace.
What are the metrics that you'll be following through the next year to make sure that China is actually adhering to those deleveraging and regulatory crackdown efforts that they've had ongoing for the past year, or perhaps that will give you a signal that they're veering away from it?
So, again, it's going to be looking beyond next year, but beyond just 2022, we're going to be tracking corporate borrowing, corporate credit access, especially looking at credit access between state and private firms, large firms and SMEs. Also, what sectors are getting, or is it the traditional sectors, such as the industrial sectors, that are getting preferential credit access again? Or are we seeing better access for these new economy firms? So those are going to be the key elements of what we continue to look at. And same thing within property, what parts of the property market continue to get some amounts of credit support and which others do not, as we look at this restructuring going on within the sector.